Hello and welcome. A very, very warm welcome tonight. Warm in both senses of the word, I'm happy to say, as we have an uncharacteristically beautiful evening here in London and a really wonderful event for you here tonight. This is the annual Runciman Award ceremony, of course, hosted jointly with the Anglo-Hellenic League, I'm very proud to say. And the award, of course, is given to the author of the best English language book or books published over the last year about some aspect of Greece. We're particularly honoured tonight because we can welcome His Royal Highness, Prince Michael of Kent. And Prince Michael is going to be presenting the prize tonight. So it's a particular delight and pleasure to have him with us. But welcome to all guests, welcome to those of you from inside King's, welcome to those of you who maybe come to King's once or twice a year for some of these amazing events that the Classics Department puts on. We're delighted to have you all. A couple of brief housekeeping notes before we get going. First of all, to remind you that the event is being live streamed, and also to remind you that we have a reception after the event. It will be here. We'll stay here in the Great Hall. You're all most welcome to stay and raise a glass with us afterwards. But first of all, I'm going to introduce John Kittmer, Chair of the Council of the Anglo-Hellenic League. And John's been chair of the Council of the Anglo-Hellenic League since 2018, I believe. And he was British Ambassador to Greece from 2013 to 2016, and previously held roles at DEFRA and the Department for Education and Employment. So John's had a long association with the Centre for Hellenic Studies at King's, which is wonderful, and he delivered the second Niki Mourahu lecture in 2020. He gained an MA in Modern Greek Studies in 2007, and after leaving diplomatic service in 2017, completed a PhD thesis on Ioannis Ritsos here at King's. And he's now writing a book based on his research, which is wonderful. So we have this amazing set of connections around many of the people who are here tonight. And if I can also just put a little word in to embarrass my colleagues from Classics by saying that they have just achieved an incredible honor of coming top in the country in the National Research Excellence Framework. So tonight is a celebration of very, very many things, and what a wonderful moment to be able to come back together in person and to be able to hear from some fantastic speakers, to have wonderful guests with us, and I'm going to pass over now to you, John. Thank you.
Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great joy to be hosting a Runciman Award ceremony in person. Like all cultural organizations, the Anglo-Hellenic League has been affected over the past 2 years or so by the pandemic across our cultural program, across our charitable activities. No event has been more affected than the Runciman Award. In 2020, we decided to hold no competition while we sought new sponsors. And last year, with 2 fantastic new sponsors in place, we could only hold the award ceremony online. This year, we've got the best of all worlds. We have a fantastic audience here in the Great Hall at King's in person tonight, and also a worldwide audience on Zoom. Whether you're listening to us online or here with us this evening, you're all very welcome. It is wonderful to meet again. It's a particular honor and pleasure to be joined here tonight by our Chief Patron and President, His Royal Highness Prince Michael of Kent. His Royal Highness, and before him, his late mother, Princess Marina, the Duchess of Kent, have supported the League across many decades. We are grateful in the League for this very special and enduring bond. So thank you for being with us here tonight and for agreeing to present the Winners' Award. Thank you. Let me also thank Professor Thain for co-hosting the event and welcoming us here this evening. I didn't know that King's Classics Department had won the National Research Framework, so congratulations to all my colleagues in the Classics Department. This is a fantastic additional point of celebration here tonight. The League itself has had an existential relationship with King's College and the other institution across the road, the London School of Economics, because these two institutions were our founding bodies. Without Ronald Burrows, the principal of King's, and William Pember-Reeves at the LSE, the League would not have come into existence in 1913. So for us at the League, King's is always one of our London homes. King's holds the League's archive. It's one of our two spiritual and intellectual homes. Gonda Van Steen, the current Korais professor, is a member of Council. She's worked tirelessly with me to put on this event tonight. I'm hugely grateful to her. She will have the final words tonight, and I think it will probably be a word of celebration. So we're all here this evening to celebrate books, to celebrate good writing, authors, translators, and particularly to celebrate in the main, in the generality, the untiring passion of Brits and the wider Anglophone world for Greece and Greeks. That passion goes back hundreds of years. Perhaps we can even give it a date. Perhaps the first point at which British interest in Greece really becomes apparent, modern Greece, contemporary Greece, the first date that it becomes really apparent is at the start of the 15th century, when the Anglo-Welsh monk Adam of Usk recorded his impressions of the very unfamiliar to him Greek liturgy that was celebrated by the Orthodox clergy, accompanying the Emperor Manuel II Palaeologus, to London in 1400. Adam of Usk wrote in Latin, so he wouldn't have won the Runciman Award, but he started the tradition, the long tradition of Britons being interested in contemporary Greece. From the mid-16th century onwards, the journeys of Britons to Greeks under Ottoman control, journeys that were sometimes commercial, sometimes diplomatic, sometimes a bit of both in motivation, these journeys spawned a really vibrant tradition of writing about contemporary Greece, a tradition that was mirrored by the scholarly interest in the Greece of antiquity, late antiquity, and Byzantium. It's this rich, diverse tradition, what Philip Sherard called the pursuit of Greece, the Greece of today and the Greece of yesterday, the long sweep of Greek history, the varieties and many gifts of Greek experience that the Runciman Award aims to celebrate. We can celebrate in this way only because of three groups of people. First, we have wonderful sponsors in the form of the A.C. Laskaridis Charitable Foundation and the A.G. Levendis Foundation. Representatives of the Levendis Foundation are here with us tonight. Our friends in the Laskaridis Foundation are watching online. I want to thank both foundations for their support for this award, and also in the case of the Levendis Foundation, their wider support for our cultural program. Secondly, we have essential support in the form of our membership. We have always been a membership organization. We've always shaken down our members' pockets. Without our members, we wouldn't have a league. Your financial support, attendance at our events, willingness to contribute to fundraising, enthusiasm to contribute by standing for council. We had our council election at our AGM earlier this afternoon, and taking part in our executive affairs. All of this makes us what we are. We have ambitious plans ahead in this post-COVID recovery period. Please stay engaged as members, and if you're here tonight in this hall or listening online and are not already a member, please join us. We'll put up a slide right at the end to just remind you about that appeal. Of course, the third indispensable group on which the award relies are the writers and the judges at the heart of the competition. I will say only a few words about them, and I'll talk about them at a later stage of the evening. But first, it's my huge pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Richard Hunter was Regius Professor of Greek in the University of Cambridge for 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. He's a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He's written or edited more than 25 books and over 100 articles on Greek and Roman literature and culture. He's a Fellow of the British Academy, a Foreign Fellow of the Academy of Athens, and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. As an undergraduate, I attended Richard's lectures, but between 2013 and 2016, when I was ambassador in Greece, I got to know Richard even better because he was then the president of the Council of the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki. This was, to say the least, a unique post for a foreigner to hold, with a unique set of challenges. Richard's qualities, his warmth, his wit, his clear-sightedness, his ability to see entrenched problems from a sharp and original perspective, seemed right for that job, and they also recommended him to me as our lecturer this evening. He's going to speak on Those Who Do Not Know the Sea, Homer and the Margins of the Greek World. Let us give him a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. The first thing I must say to those of you listening online is that the one-page handout of 3 passages of Greek is available on the front page of the Anglo-Hellenic website at www.anglohellenicleague.org. So there you have it. It's a very great pleasure to have been invited to take part in this extraordinarily wonderful occasion, and I'm very grateful to John and his colleagues for the invitation. So anyway, for much of the time when I should actually have been thinking about what I was going to say in this lecture, it was hard, nor would it have been right, to think about much else than what was happening in Ukraine. Ukrainian studies were introduced into Cambridge only as recently as my own time as head of the School of Arts and Humanities. But my homework at that time on the country and the history of the language was, as I recall, only ever superficial at best. What, however, recent terrible events have made me ponder again is how the Greeks imagined the area we call Ukraine, and indeed the north coast of the Black Sea and its hinterland more broadly, and what they actually knew about it. Broadly speaking, and I do not think this will surprise, we can record 2 different kinds of knowledge. One is largely revealed to us by archaeology. In the classical period, the cities of the Ukrainian coast, most famously perhaps the, I hope not paradoxically called Olbia, the lucky city, but also the cities of what is now the Crimea, the Tauric Chersonese, boasted a thriving Greek commercial and cultural life. Modern scholars such as David Braund and Edith Hall have in recent years done much to lay bare the very rich Greek theatrical culture of those cities, founded by Milesians and others very far away from home. This was, appropriately enough, a land of both Apollo, the god of foundations and civilized life, and Dionysus, the god of change, of the countryside, and of the theater. The revolution in Black Sea studies of the last decades, a model of international, including Russo-Ukrainian cooperation, has been transformative in our understanding. We must hope that that light has not been extinguished forever. Nor is this just some academic study. I will spare you a lengthy disquisition on the spread of Byzantine culture, including the alphabet and religion, to Russia and Ukraine, and the whole history of Kiev as a crucial crossroads for Greek culture. To look at the current conflict itself, Thucydides could have taught us a very great deal about issues of containment versus aggressive deterrent, which the long history of the preparation for this war perhaps suggests that very many in the West misjudged. As many of you will know, not only have the Black Sea coasts, north and south, been very well known to Greek merchants and settlers for more than 2 millennia, but until very recently, and we must hope still, there remained a significant Orthodox population in the area of Mariupol who thought of themselves as Greek and spoke a language known as Romaiki, or Azov Greek, probably derived ultimately from the Pontic dialect of Greek. Other views are inevitably held, as will not surprise anyone who knows how fiercely linguists fight their corner, but a language with significant borrowings from Russian and Ukrainian. These people were, in the main, descendants of Greeks brought in by Catherine the Great in the 18th century from the Crimea, in part to secure her access to and ability to exploit the Black Sea and the Aegean. Until 1937, at least, Greek was taught in local schools, and there were Greek journals and newspapers. When Stalin and the Second World War intervened, the links between Greece and modern Ukraine had begun to be re-celebrated. The great works written in Greek in the 18th and 19th century to be translated into Ukrainian, and the Greek language of Mariupol to be a subject of serious academic study. We must hope for the best, but probably fear the worst. In the meantime, I offer you as passage 1 on the handout a fragment of the dialect with translation into standard modern Greek. Please, please do not ask me to read it out. Let us rather step back to give you just one sign of the ancient literary culture of this part of the Greek world, and as something to set alongside the dialect of Mariupol. I offer you as passage 2 on the handout a poem from 2nd century Chessonisos in the Crimea, an epitaph for a lady called Oinanthe. Would that the muses, ill-fated Oinanthe, had sung songs of thanksgiving for you as children were placed on your knees, and also the lovely song of Aletheia, the goddess of childbirth, welcome gifts for your mother and father and husband. But as it is, you sleep on the chill sands by the waters of the crashing Kokitos, and you are not woken by the perpetual sound of the dear voice with which your mother laments you like a bird. You, a stone, hear nothing. Around you the dark swirling streams of ocean roll, and the spirits of the dead beneath the earth roar terribly, but you know nothing of the wailing of your parents or of your husband, since you have drunk, alas, from the Styx of forgetfulness. There's a problem in the text then. It is not bad women who die before their time, nor women of parents who are nobodies, but anyone who has outstanding beauty and family. This indeed is a true saying for men, Pytho, that any golden offspring is the first to travel to Hades. You will have to take my word for it, well, I suppose that goes for this whole lecture, that this extraordinary poem contains sophisticated allusions to and reworkings of, apart from Homer and Hesiod, whom one might have expected, Callimachus, both the Aetia and the hymns, and even more remarkably, Aristophanes. The crashing noise around Oinanthe is modeled on and echoes the crashing entrance of Aristophanes' Clouds in the play which takes its name from that chorus. The underworld rivers replace the crashing of the rivers on earth, and in this poem we hear the noise of 2 texts, not just one. I do not know of any echo of Aristophanes in ancient inscribed poetry which is remotely comparable. There is also, I would bet, an echo in this poem of Plato's Republic, but I will spare you the arguments. Who commissioned, who wrote, and who read this remarkable poem on the edges of the Greek world? Of course, in the present state of the evidence, we are not going to be able to answer any of those questions, but that does not make the questions less worth thinking about. Poems in the ancient world traveled and changed and grew as they did so. The ancient world was an echo chamber of texts, and Greek verse inscriptions are strongly inter- and metatextual. But the sounds we hear are the ceaseless whispers of a tradition without borders, a tradition which, above all, does not respect political borders. How poems traveled has much to teach us about how we should travel and interact with each other. Better known, however, to many than this rich literate culture of the northern Black Sea is this vast area as a land of the imagination and of myth. The tiny Black Sea island of Lefki, where Achilles is said to have lived happily ever after with Helen, a coupling which should make even optimists smile. And Achilles enjoyed there both cult and a rich mythology, has recently and sadly resurfaced in the news and the modern imagination as the Island of Snakes, a Ukrainian possession off the Romanian coast, but perhaps now information is very sketchy, under Russian occupation and apparently a strategic hotspot. The memory and legacy of Achilles was always a possession worth fighting over. Greek drama plays, of course, a central role in this imagining of the northern Black Sea. We think particularly of Euripides' Iphigenia among the Taurians, where some of the worst imaginings of the other, such as human sacrifice, meet, among other things, Greek values and Greek ethics. That play was also called to mind by the other great crisis of the last years, the pandemic and what has followed in its wake. Orestes is to be sacrificed by his priestess sister until the inevitable recognition is effected. In the course of the play, Orestes tells of his reception in Athens. Polluted as he was from the killing of his mother in revenge for the killing of his father, Agamemnon, no one could have anything to do with him. But the Athenian king, whose name, alas, was not Boris, decreed that in an inversion of the idea of symposium, of drinking together, all citizens should separately drink their own wine, each at his or her own table, set 2 meters apart from each other. Okay, I made that last bit up, but you get the message. So that no one would have to be dangerously close to Orestes and thus potentially infected by his pollution, and he would receive appropriately equal and hospitable treatment. This etiology for social distancing was in fact the etiology of the Athenian festival of the Koes, the pitchers, one of the markers of the arrival of spring. Etiology is one way in which the past shapes the present, and like the ancients, we shape the past by selective memory. The Black Sea, then, was a frontier of the mind as well as of geography. It was there, by repute, that the very first ship, the Argo, sailed all the way to modern Georgia, a journey which changed everything. What Greek poets could not decide was whether those changes were for good or for ill. Did the gods ever intend us to cross the seas? The story of the Argonautic voyage from Pelion to Georgia and back, as told in the 3rd century before Christ by Apollonius of Rhodes, incorporates, in fact, both views. On the way out, the Argonauts hug the southern shore of the Black Sea, as good sailors and merchants would have done. On the way back, however, they quite literally follow a star and sail right across the open Black Sea to northeastern Romania and western Ukraine. That is where the real nightmare starts, close to where it both started and ended for Ovid in his land of exile and Tristia. These 2 views of sailing, the exploratory but relatively safe and productive, and exposure to the open sea with its unknown dangers and very great likelihood of death, recur time and again in Greek literature. We see this again, in fact, when the Argonauts are nearly home. The final obstacle placed in the way of the Argonauts' safe return to the Greek mainland is an impenetrably thick darkness in the open sea north of Crete. They are saved by the intervention of Apollo and his brilliant light. Apollo, in his role as savior god, holds his golden bow aloft and shines a brilliant light which breaks up the darkness in all directions. That description would, I think, have reminded Apollonius's readers of nothing so much as the Faros Lighthouse at the entrance to the harbors of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, built, as the inscription reported by Strabo tells us, for the safety of those who sail at sea. Here, then, a marvel of Greek engineering is translated back into myth, but the lesson it carries is only made sharper by that. Epic poetry, above all that of Homer, is never far away when the Greeks thought of the distant, the dangerous, and the marginal. In his essay on Homer, for example, Dio Chrysostom, in the late 1st century after Christ, proudly claims, "Homer's poetry is so sublime and grand, and also so sweet, that it has for so long enthralled not just men who have the same tongue and language as the poet, but also many of the barbarians. Some men who speak 2 languages and are of mixed race know his verses very well, though they are ignorant of much else which is Greek, and some too who live very far away. It is said that the Indians sing Homer's poetry and have translated it into their own speech and language. The Indians have never seen many of our stars. It is said, for example, that bears are not visible where they live, and yet they know of the sufferings of Priam and mourning and lamentations of Andromache and Hecuba, and of the bravery of Achilles and Hector. So powerful is the poetry of one man. Moreover, I think that many barbarians who are even more ignorant than the Indians have heard of the name of Homer, though they have no clear idea of what it means, whether it is an animal, a plant, or something else. Dio's claims for Homer belong, of course, to the cultural imaginaire and to the rhetoric of empire, rather than to any consideration of facts. But India is not there chosen by chance, for since Alexander's conquests, it had marked one very potent boundary of a world which both was and was not Greek. Alexander had quite literally carried Homer with him as he moved east. According to Plutarch, or to someone like Plutarch, in the work entitled On the Fortune of Alexander, Alexander educated the Hyrcanians to respect the marriage bond, and taught the Arachosians to till the soil, and persuaded the Sogdians to support their parents, not to kill them, and the Persians to revere their mothers and not to take them in wedlock. O wondrous power of philosophic instruction that brought the Indians to worship Greek gods and the Scythians to bury their dead, not to devour them. When Alexander was civilizing Asia, Homer was commonly read, and the children of the Persians, of the Susianians, and of the Gedrosians learned to chant the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides. Those who are vanquished by Alexander are happier than those who escaped his hand, for these had no one to put an end to the wretchedness of their existence, while the victor compelled those others to lead a happy life, to be in Greek eudaimon. What matters here is not, of course, what must now seem the absurdity of such colonialist rhetoric, but rather the link which the Greeks made between Homer and Greek civilization, and the way in which that was expressed through distant margins. What is now Ukraine is again very present here. In the Borystheneid oration, Dio Chrysostom tells the story of an episode from his exile in which he visited what he calls the now somewhat barbarized city of Borysthenes, Olbia, situated on the banks of the Hypanis River. After a description of the city, Dio tells how all the citizens of the city were obsessed with Homer, and their reverence for Achilles was extreme even by Black Sea standards. For the citizens of the city, knowledge of Homer and imitation of Homeric characters are potent marks of their Greekness. Although, says Dio, in general they no longer speak a pure Greek because they live in the midst of barbarians, and here I think it seems, however unfair, impossible for us not again to think of the Pontic dialects. Nevertheless, virtually everyone, according to Dio, knows at least the Iliad by heart. Dio is clearly building on visible and prominent features of the cultural landscape of the northern Black Sea coast. Cults of Achilles had for centuries been a feature of this landscape, and Dio's claim that the Borysthenites had founded a temple of Achilles on the island named after him is strongly supported by an elegiac poem in the hero's honor, which is roughly contemporary with Dio and was indeed found on the island of Beretsan, just off the coast. There clearly was a great interest in the area in the cult of Achilles under the title of ruler of Pontos. There is also at this period, strikingly, an apparent increase in the number of individuals apparently named Achilles. And so I think that clearly was a feature that would have struck any visitors to the region, particularly as Achilles seems to be the uniquely favored among Homeric names. There is an inscription which records one young lady who was given the name Briseis, and what on earth her parents were thinking of, I have no idea, nor do we know how she made it through life with the name of Briseis. The citizens of Borysthenes are, for Dio, stuck in a time warp, living in a historical theme park. In some ways, perhaps not unlike Williamsburg, Virginia, except that there's no sign that this theme park was designed for tourists. Their devotion to Homer has put them on the path of Hellenization, but now they will be forced to see what a long way they still have to travel. Contemporary social and intellectual conditions demand a more complex response than simple imitation of Homer. Homer will always be part of that response, and Homer's place at the margins will always be assured. But margins must always find ways of evolving, adapting, and moving on. If that reminds some of you of the Greek diaspora, then I think it should, and I shall return to this. What then of the Homeric poems themselves? Odysseus's travels have long been enlighteningly read in colonialist terms and in terms of cultural identity. When Odysseus blinds the Cyclops, it's hardly an accident that it is a simile from shipbuilding that is used to describe the horrific act. Greek technical skill overcomes the monstrous and the barbarous. But I just want to be concerned in the final part of this lecture with one episode of Odysseus's travels. In Book 11 of the Odyssey, Odysseus tells of his trip to the underworld, the ultimate margin at the edge of the world. This is passage 3 on your handout. Odysseus goes to visit Tiresias, the blind prophet, and one of the things he learns is his own future, what will happen to him after the killing of the suitors. When you have slain the suitors in your halls, Tiresias tells him, whether by guile or openly with sharp sword, then go abroad, taking a shapely oar, till you come to men that know nothing of the sea, and eat their food unmixed with salt, who in fact know nothing of ships or of shapely oars. And I will tell you a most certain sign, which will not escape you. When another wayfarer on meeting you shall say that you have a winnowing fan on your shoulder, then fix in the earth your oar and make handsome offerings to the Lord Poseidon, and depart for your home and offer sacred hecatombs to the immortal gods who hold broad heaven. And death shall come to you yourself away from the sea, ex halos, the gentlest imaginable, that shall lay you low when you are overcome with sleek old age, and your people shall be dwelling in prosperity around you. These famously riddling verses have generated a huge modern bibliography, but not even that can blunt their mysterious power. Odysseus is told to go until it's not told how he should go, until he reaches people who do not know the sea. Who are they? You will be unsurprised again to learn that ancient scholars came up with more than one answer to this question. One of the most powerful was the answer of Porphyry in the 3rd century after Christ in his work on the Cave of the Nymphs in the Odyssey. For Porphyry, the Homeric Odysseus is a man and the embodiment of a soul which has passed through every stage of Genesis in its wanderings and now returns to its real spiritual and intellectual world, far from the turbulent waves of everyday embodied existence. Those who do not know the sea and its salt are those beyond all the pains and salty bitterness of the material world. The soul has returned to its true home. Those, however, who have, with great struggle, sought to put the bodily passions and their pains behind them, must make reparations to the gods of the material world by further struggle, until they are so far from the sea that the tools which represent it, such as an oar, are utterly unknown. Then finally, the soul will be at peace in the intelligible world. Now, such Neoplatonist allegory is not to everyone's taste, and yet the basic idea upon which Porphyry elaborates, that Odysseus stands for all of us in our struggles, and that the Odyssey is, as it were, just that, the paradigmatic Odyssey of all lives, is as familiar to us now, think perhaps above all of Cavafis's Ithaki, as it was to the Homeric interpreters of antiquity. We can no longer, I think, do without the idea of life's Odyssey and of life as an Odyssey. On a rather different, but perhaps no less important level, is the fact that the journey to find people who do not know what an oar is and have no knowledge of the sea uses a folktale motif attested from several cultures. One such Greek story, usually told of St. Elias, is of a sailor who, wanting nothing further to do with the sea, traveled with an oar until someone failed to recognize it, and there he stayed. That story is an etiology for why chapels to the saint are found on mountaintops, though it would in fact be easy enough to produce a reading along Porphyrian lines. The saint finally reaches a place where he can contemplate and worship his God in peace, and there he stays. Many, however, see the Odyssey story in the Odyssey story an implicit etiology for why Poseidon was in several places worshipped inland. At the very least, Odysseus will pay honor to Poseidon in an area which did not know him before. Now, in most such stories, the traveler settles down once the sea is so far away that people do not know it. But Odysseus will return home, and that is important. The more that one reflects on this story, on the figure of Odysseus as a kind of everyman or pilgrim, both in pagan and Christian readings, and on the importance of the sea to Greek self-identity, think, of course, most famously of Xenophon's Thalassa, Thalassa, the more tempting it becomes to read Tiresias's words as indeed a mythic etiology for the more modern Greek diaspora, and for the intimately related idea of nostos, the very first word which Tiresias speaks to Odysseus after he has drunk the blood. The return to the homeland is always difficult and painful, as Tiresias predicts for Odysseus. In such a mythic reading, those who do not know the sea does not mean necessarily those who have never literally seen it, but those who do not yet understand what it signifies, who have not been exposed to what we might call the culture of the sea. If Odysseus carried an oar with him, Alexander carried Homer. And as we have seen, the poems are, like Odysseus's oar, a potent, perhaps the most potent image of Greek culture. I first read Homer in a country which has been one of the greatest beneficiaries of the diaspora, Australia. And although I was offered the chance to read Homer not because of the diaspora, but rather because I attended a school built very firmly on an English model, the significant Greek presence in Sydney, and even more so, of course, in Melbourne, meant that Greece soon came to seem not quite as far away as it might otherwise have done. The very first piece of real joined-up Greek I read was Xenophon's account in the Anabasis of how to catch bustards in the deserts of the Euphrates, and you can't get much more like Australia than that. Now, notions of center and periphery have always been very important to Greek cultural identity. And as you have seen, but there was a time when, perhaps wrongly, I did not think you could get more peripheral than Australia. There was a time when we were constantly urged to move away from an alleged ethnocentrism and consider other narratives of Greek culture and history. But one might think that this tension, like the extraordinary physical geography of Greece itself, how central or how peripheral are the islands, for example, is itself part of that cultural identity. The margins are always important because, as Odysseus has taught us, there is always another margin beyond that. If Odysseus and his oar can, on a macroscopic level, point us towards the Greek diaspora, towards the need always to seek new audiences and new places of settlement, the image has another smaller scale significance for those of us involved in the teaching of Greek studies, most notably, but not of course exclusively, ancient Greek studies. If the diaspora was, in many cases, forced upon Greeks by terrible and violent acts, modern teachers of Greek studies are compelled to pursue an intellectual diaspora, the need to spread the word, to win over new recruits for the subject and the language of Poseidon, or risk a fairly rapid withering. Moreover, although St. Elias stayed where he was, ex halos, away from the sea, as Tiresias might have said, Odysseus, like Plato's philosopher returning to the cave, will have, like us, to return to where he set out from, to see, as we would put it, to business. There can be no secure retreat. Even the mountaintop hermit will be plagued by uncertainties. The past cannot be sealed off from how we live now. Odysseus in the underworld is in fact a kind of authorizing model for the study of the Greek past. There the ghosts of the past, not all dead white males, it must be said, tell him their stories, and he learns not just about them, but also about himself. The study of the past is, of course, a kind of necromancy, which is never going to yield more than fragments and half-remembered conversations. Odysseus's repeated stress upon how much he cannot tell us, how many ghosts remain just that, is almost a model of our vain attempts to understand in something like a satisfying fullness. We cling to what James Porter called a fantasy of classicism, the idea that we can be in direct contact with the great figures of the past. But there are always veils which block direct access, not unlike Odysseus's use of indirect rather than direct speech in the catalogue of women. The ghosts cannot speak directly to us. That, however, is, I hope, not a counsel of despair. We owe it to the past, and indeed to the Greeks of Mariupol and elsewhere, not to give up the struggle to understand the past, not to drink the Black Sea water of Lethe, which wipes out individual and collective memory. I myself have just been for the first time to Estonia and learned there much about how remembering the past is inseparable from and utterly necessary for considering the Ukrainian present. There are, however, other as well insidious dangers also to the life-giving presence of historical memory, if one can compare small with great. The threats which we see everywhere to the humanities in general and to the study of the Greek cultural past in particular, threats frighteningly present, I'm afraid, in this very city and not very far from where we are today. Those threats will, if ultimately successful, turn society into a bleak wasteland where we will no longer be able to talk to the ghosts, even after we have offered them all our blood. Once gone, the memory and the knowledge will not return. And those of us who live in a country which has recently chosen retreat and isolation over openness, argument, and engagement may well feel such dangers even more acutely. The Greek model, like the aims of the Anglo-Hellenic League, serve to remind us of the importance of such engagement and such remembering. The epic song of traditional cultures works to preserve memory, not necessarily of truth, but of something much more important. Thank you.
Let me thank Richard really warmly on behalf of all of us for such a thought-provoking and indeed, particularly with its references to what's going on around the Black Sea and north of the Black Sea now, moving talk, for oscillating so skillfully between antiquity and modernity, between Homer and the modern diaspora, for a lifetime of spreading the word about Greece, and indeed for talking to the ghosts. I think we have talked to quite a few ghosts this evening, profitably, as always. Thank you very much. I hope you'll have the opportunity to stay and mingle, because it was so rich. I think many of us will want to unpack it. And alas, I don't have time to do an analytical vote of thanks. But thank you so much, Richard, for speaking to us this evening. It's really appreciated. So we now come on to the award ceremony itself. We're going to do this in two parts. I shall in a moment invite Peter Frankopan, the Chair of Judges, to come to the lectern, and then when Peter has told you about this year's award and indeed announced the winner, I will come back and summon a number of you to the platform for the award ceremony itself. I said earlier that the competition relies fairly obviously on the authors and the translators, the publishers who make book nominations every year. But it also relies existentially on our panel of judges who every year apply their own expertise as writers, and their different types of knowledge of the Greek field and their sense of what makes a good book for readers. It's this balance between writerly skill and readability that's at the heart of the Runciman Award. Let me congratulate all the long-listed and shortlisted authors in the competition this year, and let me thank our wonderful panel of judges. Peter has chaired them brilliantly, if I may say so, this year as he did last year, and I will leave it to Peter to talk about the jury panel. Peter himself scarcely needs an introduction. Here he is. Professor of Global History at Oxford University, where he is Stavros Niarchos Foundation Director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research. He works on the history and politics of the Mediterranean, Russia, the Middle East, Persia, Iran, Central Asia, China, and beyond. It's kind of a busy period for Peter, I think, at the moment. His books, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, and The New Silk Roads, The Future and Present of the World, are major international bestsellers. We really do benefit from having Peter and his distinguished panel of jurors with us. Thank you so much, Peter, and please take the stage.
Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends in the room and those watching online, it's an enormous pleasure to be on the stage on behalf of the jury of this year's Runciman Prize. I feel like I'm doing the Eurovision announcement. I should also say a few thanks first to the Anglo-Hellenic League and its officers, but also to John Kittmer, who works tirelessly behind the scenes to corral everybody into place, and those Herculean efforts are very well needed to make this stay on the road. Prizes are difficult to choose between outstanding books in the first place, but I'm incredibly grateful for the support I've been given, and through me, the judges and the publishers, and above all, the authors. Thank you to King's for being here. It's no shame to become a runner-up to the Centre for Hellenic Studies and to the Classics Department. If you have Usain Bolt in the race, it's no problem at all when they do well. So congratulations to the wonderful work you do here at King's, particularly in the Greek world. There are, as Professor Hunter said in his dazzling lecture, We need to fight to keep humanities alive, and I think Professor Hunter's lecture, if nothing else, was a wonderful call to arms to remind us how important study of the humanities is. I should also thank the sponsors on behalf of my fellow judges and the A.G. Leventis Foundation, the Lascaridis Foundation, for making this possible. And then above all to my fellow judges who are, I believe, all watching online. So good evening, Nisha McSweeney, Judith Mossman, Sof Kazinoviev, and Dionysius Kapsalis, who have been my fellow judges for the last couple of years. They have read widely, they have shared their counsel, but it's been a joy to work with such diverse, interesting, kind people who have been keen to share their experiences. It's not always the case that you can reach agreements, but with such a nice group of people, it's been honestly a real joy. This year's been tough. As John mentioned, last year we had to do everything online. COVID held up the postal systems. Unfortunately, as Professor Hunter said, I think the reason why many books didn't make their way to Greece and we had to do this through PDFs was for other reasons that we've decided to make life slightly harder for ourselves than perhaps we needed to. This year's selection of books that were nominated were absolutely outstanding, as is, in fact, always the case, and it is a difficult thing to try to narrow down books into long lists, short lists, and to find a winner. Any one of the shortlisted books, in fact, all of the long-listed books could have been and would have been worthy winners too. Taken as a whole, it shows an extraordinary range of interest in everything to do about Greece and Greek culture and Greek politics, spreading over millennia. And there are not many subjects that one can say that about. We've had reimaginings of ancient wars, we've had studies of politicians in the modern era, discussions about the foundation or refoundation of modern Greek. This has been a very rich set of books across multiple forms of fiction, non-fiction, poetry. It's been a privilege to read all of these. So it would seem to me that Hellenic Studies is in robust health in terms of the interest and productivity, but it is vital to keep the next generation involved under enormous pressures, as we all know. I'll say a few words about the 8 shortlisted books. In no obvious reason, I sort of picked them blindly in order to not give any indication of who might be the winner, and then I will announce the book that my fellow judges and I have decided would be the most worthy in a very, very strong field. I'm sure many of you will have read these books. If you haven't, we have nice weather this week at least, and the summer to come, so please pop into your local independent bookshop or wherever you get your books online and support booksellers too, who are immensely knowledgeable, and the more of these books you buy, the more they'll be recommended to other people too. And as I've started to say as I get older, if you have nephews, nieces, children, grandchildren, please buy them a second copy and give to them as well. It's not too early to start. We sometimes forget about the power of the gift of books, even if they want video games. We all enjoyed Michael Llewellyn-Smith's exemplary study of Venizelos, the making of a Greek statesman. Venizelos needs no introduction. It's a beautifully written book by a former ambassador to Greece, immaculate research, and it's absolutely riveting. The first book of 2, I believe, in the biography of such an important man in Greek national identity and history. Ruth Bedell, one of my all-time favourite writers, her Daughters of the Labyrinth, an extraordinary linking up of multiple themes, just as Professor Hunter did, linking ancient Greece with the modern world in the 20th century, taking us through Crete in the Second World War and leading us through archaeology, memories, reconciliations in a typically beautiful and moving way. It's a great pleasure always to see Byzantine books on the list, and this year, Geoffrey Benneker and Craig Gibson's translation of Byzantine Sinbad, which you'll see as part of the Harvard series, was an outstanding translation of an 11th century, late 11th century translation of a Syriac text, which was itself a translation of a Persian text. And I think it's very important to remind ourselves of the inclusivity and joining up of the ancient and medieval and modern worlds. The globalization we talk about and linking together regions, Greece is much more than Southeast Europe and the Aegean, as we've heard, and the perspectives and the field of vision really does go from Constantinople under the Byzantines through to Scandinavia, including into Estonia, up to Iceland, right the way down into West Africa and as far as the Himalayas and indeed beyond. And this book, this wonderful translation, incredibly elegant, allows us to see a cosmopolitan, kaleidoscopic empire being interested in morality stories. Pat Barker, who again needs no introduction, a superstar, novelist, wrote Women of Troy, which again are some of the themes we're seeing today in Ukraine, reminds us of the ways in which wars are portrayed as being heroic, but actually are all about suffering, and in particular they're about the suffering of women. Pat Barker has written an incredibly moving, elegiac book that is filled with sadness and reminiscences, sexual violence, and reminds us of the costs of conflict. Ian Collins' John Craxton, A Life of Gifts, is about an artist who was very celebrated in a very stylish English Philhellene in the middle of the 20th century, who had a rich, colourful, and complex personal life, as well as an outstanding role played within a set of English aesthetes, artists, and scholars. He paints Ian Collins, who knew John Craxton personally, paints a picture of Greece, but also of Philhellenism, of aesthetics, of culture, the natural landscape, in an outstanding book. Dimitris Siovas has written a book on Greece from the junta to the crisis, modernization, transition, and diversity. And as he says at the beginning of his book, there are very few books written about the post-junta era of modern Greece, and his book is about the period which he compares to the Swiss phase of Greek history, where differences were put to one side after 1974, and there were attempts to lead to reforms, reconciliations, and to find the roots of modern Greece that is how it is today. And this has been poorly covered in the past, and Siovas has done an excellent job too. So too has Mark Mazawas, whose Greek Revolution, 1821 and the Making of Modern Europe, was well-timed to come out with the bicentenary of the independence of Greece last year. And as you'd expect from such a renowned historian, it's an exemplary and stimulating study that, again, places Greece in a context beyond the Aegean and southeastern Europe, but shows how Greece and its fortunes and its continuities after independence were very closely linked, not only to Russia, Britain, but far beyond to, for a non-fiction book, highly readable and page-turner, that's very hard to do, despite what one might think. And then finally, Nectaria Anastasiadou, in an astonishing debut novel, A Recipe for Daphne. It's extraordinarily accomplished, taking us through the Rum population in Constantinople, Istanbul. It's a love story, it's a story of discovery, one with longing, and tells us about a community that has dwindled over the last decades and century. These books have been an absolute privilege to read, and also it does take time to do, but a privilege to discuss with such a fantastic panel. So I'm very grateful to the discussions we've had that have opened up new ideas too, and on the second and third readings, I was grateful for those. Choosing a book to win the Ransom Award always involves some discussion about what the award is actually trying to do. And as John Kittmer said, trying to encourage people to read and to open up new kinds of books, trying to think about the past in different ways, and to try to find ways to encourage general readers into the field of Hellenism, Greece, Greek culture, and peoples. It always involves a difficult and complex decision. This year, as I say, all 8 books could have won, and it looked at one point that all 8 of them might have done, but we were told very politely by John, who sits in the meetings but never says anything, that wouldn't be perhaps the most sensible or helpful thing to do. So after a great deal of discussion, we chose a book that is incredibly original, highly readable, beautifully researched, wonderfully written, and we also thought would not just do justice to the Runciman Prize, but would do justice to Sir Stephen Runciman himself for multiple and obvious reasons. And I'm not sure what it is that the great Stephen Runciman would have chosen of these books, but I think we're doing him proud this evening in announcing that this year's winner is Ian Collins' John Craxton, A Life of Gifts. Congratulations.
I think another round of applause.
Okay, thank you. Great. Could we have some slides, please? Ah, great. Your Royal Highness, thank you. In my delight at being long-listed for this award, I clean forgot to check out the competition. And then when I was even more delighted to be shortlisted, I did check out the other 7 contenders, and I thought, blimey. And it would have been an honour to finish 8th in this distinguished company. And so bravo to all in a stellar year for books about Greece. I warmly thank the judges, sponsors, and the Anglo-Hellenic League, and especially John Kittmer. This wonderful award is the icing on the cake for John Craxton in his centenary year. Hail to Yale University Press, especially Director Mark Eastman, my editor Johanna Stevenson, and designer Raymond Watkins. The YUP team made A Life of Gifts a happy lockdown project and a beautiful book. I thank Richard Riley, my co-trustee of the Craxton estate. Most of all, I cheer the late, great, and often so underestimated John Craxton for giving me his story. Finally. We met at a funeral in London in January 2000. He looked like this, only rather more unkempt. I often think I'm turning into him, actually. In fact, he looked as if he'd just blown in from the White Mountains of Crete and abandoned a flock of goats on Piccadilly. He was unmissable and unstoppable. The boy who had longed to live and work in Greece had secured his wish and not been disappointed. Now he was the image of a Cretan village elder, and he spoke just like one in Demotic Greek. During this visit back to his native London, amazing memories flowed all through the afternoon and on into the evening in the French pub in Soho. There was a flood of jokes of the kind that had charmed his friends and alarmed officialdom. Before midnight, I begged to write his biography. Over my dead body, he said. I've banned any book on my life since 1948, and I won't be changing my mind now. So, of course, I started keeping notes in secret. On the bus home, when he phoned, and whenever I went to the Craxton family house in Hampstead, whose somewhat unhygienic kitchen became my favourite place in the whole world. John would pour a lot of vodka and a little tonic while concocting fabulous meals. The golden talk never stopped, except when I fled to the loo with my hidden notebook. His marvellous memory challenged received opinion. He was startling, funny, profound, infinitely touching. Hedonism maintained in old age is valiant. No one ever enjoyed life more than he did, and his consummate gift was to share that pleasure in deathless and priceless art. My long labour of love has been to capture a sensualist story and what I see as a world of lost enchantment to set beside the pictures. He finally agreed that I could write a monograph on his art for his 90th birthday, but sadly it came out after his death. And while we were taping interviews for that, he suddenly said, well, it's clear to me that you'll be writing a book of your own once I'm out of the way. I better make sure it's accurate. So then he helped me with the odyssey that became A Life of Gifts 21 years after my first notes. At one point, I thought the book might appear over my dead body. I called Hilary Sperling, best of all biographers, and wailed, "This book is killing me." She said, "Of course it's killing you. If it doesn't kill you, it won't be any good." So I'm very happy to be here this evening after my near-death experience. A Life of Gifts is a telling title. John was superbly talented, supremely lucky, and charming enough to live largely off handouts. His best book cover for Paddy Lee Firma was for the memoir A Time of Gifts. How fortunate he was in his musical, bohemian, and open-hearted London family. Here they are. John is the third from the left. The novelist Elizabeth Jane Howard said, "The Craxtons were happy, and happiness like pollen rubbed onto anyone who came in contact with them." His mother and father took in penniless music students for lunch, a weekend, a month, or 4 years. To save on beds and food bills, they sent their own children away to boarding schools of mixed ability, where they rarely lasted long, then on to friends and relations, any willing taker. Loving and trusting, they might now be prosecuted for child neglect. A nomadic life became John Craxton. Wanting only to draw and paint, he never passed an academic exam in his life, even in art. And from an early age, he was determined to get to Greece. He loved the mythology, the art from antiquity to El Greco, and yearned for his place in the sun. With undiagnosed tuberculosis, he needed a hot, dry climate more than he ever knew. Held up by the little matter of World War II, during which he became a youthful prodigy of modern English art with best friend Lucian Freud, he depicted lonely figures in menaced landscapes, all emblematic portraits of the artist himself. But despite the introspection in his art, he was ever a social animal. His melancholic self-depictions may also imply a hangover. Eventually, at the age of 23, in May 1946, he escaped to Greece. In typical Craxton style, he flew with the wife of the British ambassador to Athens in a borrowed bomber. Lucian followed for 5 months. John never looked back. He often returned to London and wandered widely, but from now on, almost every picture was inspired by Aegean light, life, and landscapes, most of all by the warmth of the people. Whatever the hardships etched on the faces of his models, they appeared on the point of smiling or laughing. Their innate high spirits cannot be broken, even by dire poverty, even by civil war, and the artist is bound to be egging them on with awful or awesome jokes. Although choosing life over art, he has left a matchless portrait of his adopted homeland in the last years before mass tourism and amid what he called the survival of myth in everyday existence. He had famous friends but depicted ordinary people, shepherd families, sailors, taverna dancers, the company he liked best. A Life of Gifts has just been published in Greek by Patakis and is now being translated into Turkish. And a centenary touring exhibition has begun at the Benaki Museum in Athens, where it can be seen until September the 11th. The show then moves to Crete, to the Municipal Art Gallery in John's adopted Hania in October, and Mesha Istanbul in March. John never cared to sell his pictures, except to friends, and by the end, when he had some money, he wanted to buy them back. Most works in the centenary show are from the estate, many previously unseen, but the highlight is this vast tapestry made in Edinburgh in the early 70s during his exile under the colonels. As a friend put it, Johnny had to leave Greece when his jokes ran away with him. An anarchic spirit had mocked authority once too often. Commissioned for the New University of Stirling, the tapestry John designed is entitled Landscape with the Elements. He drove 6 weavers to distraction over 18 months in his insistence on using every colour in the spectrum for a work of vaunting ambition. But it's his and their masterpiece. When he got back to Greece from 1976, his humane and uplifting pictures became bigger, brighter, bolder, alive and ablaze in the sun with people, goats and cats. This image of typical Craxton shows a Cretan shepherd lassoing a ram, but it's also based on a Minoan gold cup from a royal tomb in Sparta, showing scenes of wild bull capture, which is in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. In the end, for John Craxton, the art and the biography are all of a piece, a wild adventure charting a lifelong love affair with Greece. Thank you all.
Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasurable task to express my thanks. My name is Gonda Van Steen, and I'm the Corais Chair here at the Center for Hellenic Studies. It has been a pleasure to be able to co-host this event with the Anglo-Hellenic League. But let's not kid ourselves, John Kittmer has been doing the heavy lifting, and a special thanks goes to him. He's way too modest to accept it, but rest assured. Of course, an event like this is impossible to hold without our sponsors. Again, a thank you to the Levendis Foundation and the members of the Levendis Foundation who always grace us with their presence, and to the Laskaridis Foundation who is with us online. Professor Hunter gave us the most amazing, touching talk, pushing out the boundaries of diaspora, turning a victim diaspora into a diaspora of richness, pushing out the diachronic, geographical, poetic boundaries of a topic of the margins and making it central to our focus. Thank you to Professor Frankopan for sharing the judges who went through the blissful task of spending a summer reading. Bliss it must be. The authors, of course, should not be forgotten. So many people who put their books in, not writing for the pleasure of writing, researching for the pleasure of writing, and then, of course, if a winning book is selected, it's the joy for every one of us. And thank you to the winner, Ian Collins, who gave us an evening of gifts. The Hellenic bookstore here in London will have these books available, so you shouldn't have to look very far. We also thank the people who took practical care of the evening, the King's team, the many people who have joined us to get the logistics in order. Of course, members of the audience, thank you very much, both at home and online. If you're not a member yet, then this must be the most convincing evening. Do join us, otherwise you will have John shaking you up, so you may as well take my word for it. A final thank you then, for a final invitation to our reception. I'm going to go back to the words of Professor Hunter. Number 1 on your handout, it ends with, and I read in Greek to then translate, δίνουν βραβεία, αν νικήσεις 3 άτομα, κερδίζεις ένα πρόβατο. Εσύ έρχεσαι, άλλος έρχεται. Here's your invitation to the reception. Then you don't have to win an award, and no, you won't be given sheep, but there is a glass of wine and there are bites. Come along, be merry, and eat with us. Thank you.